Okay. Start the presentation now.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Peter Batey, and I'm welcoming you to the special session on Great Minds in Regional Science. I'm joined this afternoon by three speakers, each of whom is going to talk about a great mind in regional science. Could I have the next slide, please? My name is Peter Batey, and I've been involved in regional science for quite a long time. What I'm going to talk about this afternoon is Great Minds in Regional Science, which is a project of the Regional Science Academy. I share my interest in the Regional Science Academy by the fact that I'm the archivist for the Regional Science Association. So I have a special interest in the history of regional science. And just very recently, in the course of the last 2 weeks, we've published the first book on the subject of Great Minds in Regional Science. And I want to say a little bit about that in the next few minutes. Next slide, please. So the book, Great Minds in Regional Science, is the first volume in what will turn out to be a series. It was published a couple of weeks ago, and it's published by Springer, and I want to say a few words about what that book contains, because it does relate directly to our session this afternoon. Next slide, please. So Great Minds in Regional Science, I think we've just jumped on, yeah. Three main sections, three main types of great mind that we're interested in publishing. The first is really talking about where regional science started and how we came to have a Regional Science Association. So in a sense, the chapters in that section are about our institutional history. The following two sections, the first of them is antecedents, and they reflect great minds who weren't active in Regional Science Association, but can be recognized now as regional scientists, even though they might have been working in the 19th century or the early 20th century. They were nevertheless doing what we would now recognize as regional science. And then the third section is very prominent regional scientists who, during the life of the Regional Science Association, have really been responsible for laying the foundations of the subject, for creating the ideas and the organization of regional science. So just to have a look, next slide, please. The volume that's just been published, first section there, establishing regional science and the Regional Science Association. We have three chapters there. As you might expect, there's a chapter about Walter Izard, who was the founding father of regional science. But we also have chapters that talk about the development of regional science in Japan. And we've singled out three very important Japanese regional scientists who contributed to setting up regional science in Japan. And then the third chapter there talks about regional science and how it developed in Europe, and is focusing there on Rolf Funk, who in Germany particularly, but across the rest of Europe, did a lot to set regional science on its current track. Next slide, please. Amongst the antecedents of regional science, we have four contributions there. You can see, for example, that Peter Nijkamp is writing about August Lersch. I'm picking out a less known regional scientist, Philip Sargent Florence, in my chapter. And then Hans Westlund, who we'll be hearing from in a few minutes, has taken his subject, Gunnar Myrdal. We move on to the third section there. Next slide, please. Final section, laying the foundations of regional science. We've got another 4 chapters there: Martin Beckmann, Julian Wolpert, Edward Ullman, Waldo Tobler. So that volume has been completed. It started life as a series of presentations at Regional Science Academy meetings held all over the world. And having published the first volume and drawn breath, we've now moved on to volume 2. Next slide, please. So we started work there. We've got regional scientists actively involved in preparing their chapters, and we're adding to that on a monthly basis by drawing in what will ultimately be about 12 chapters in the book. And we expect that the book will be published as volume 2 next year in 2021. Next slide, please. So we've got 3 presentations this afternoon, all of which would fit into the antecedents category that I talked about a moment ago. We've got Roberto Camagni talking about Adam Smith. We've got André talking about François Perroux, and Hans Westlund, as I said, talking about Gunnar Myrdal. So I think without further ado, I would like to call to the platform, if we have a platform, André Torre, who's going to be our first speaker, and we'll talk about François Perroux. Next speaker, please.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Yes, so thank you very much, and thank you very much for the attention. So my name is André Torre, and I'm at that moment I'm trying to upload my presentation and to put it at the start. So thank you for your attention, but also okay. And then this afternoon, I will speak about François Perroux. And François Perroux was a great economist in France, and also one of the fathers of regional science in France and abroad. So just to say that François Perroux was pretty well known in the 20th century. And he had a lot of discussions, friendships, also opposition to Walter Isard about the topic of regional science and the goals of regional science. And he had influential publications in the 50s and the 60s. And also he was one of the founders of a French-speaking association, and he made major contribution to regional science on the one hand, but also to the theory of development through this concept of growth pole and development theory as well. So I have to say that François Perroux was very interesting guy. So I start with a short biography of François Perroux. So he was born at the start of the 20th century. And he was a very brilliant scholar, of course, and he was in the start of his academic career was when he was appointed Rockefeller Fellow in the 30s, and he made visits in Austria, in Deutschland, in Italy, when he met a lot of famous German speakers. And also he started his collaboration. He was very fond of Schumpeter. So he initiated the French translation and wrote the introduction of Schumpeter's theory of economic evolution. And then he started to publish books in the 30s on that basis. During the 40s, his role was pretty controversial during the Second World War, because he was said to be collaborating a bit, but until 47, he became one and probably the major and one of the major French economists. and he wrote various contributions in field of development, planning, economic space, regional development, and he opened also the way to mathematical economics in France, and he played afterwards a great role as an advisor regarding development process in various underdeveloped and countries and regions. So I have to reduce, of course, my speech to a few points. So I'd like first to insist on Perroux's contribution to economic theory, which is based mainly on his very skeptical approach of neoclassical thinking. So he was not convinced of the role of the market, and he was very fond of the idea of organization like the states, the institution, and also he did never adhere to the idea that balance was growth, but it was really uneven, and above all, he thought that the notion of power was forgotten, that the economic approach. So at the start of his career, he was a kind of neo-Austrian economist, but quite fast he moved to evolutionism, and in the spirit of Schumpeter, of course. And then he pretty worked on the consideration of asymmetries between different types of agents. Of course, he was a critic of a general equilibrium model because he thought that he never liked the idea of agents, but he preferred the idea of active units, like say individuals, organizations, firms, institutions, associations, and so on, of different types were interacting, playing together, and making opposition and collaborating. And he conceived also the economic way of development as a kind of what he called a struggle competition. And this struggle competition is finally very close to the contemporaneous idea of competition, which means a mix between collaboration or cooperation on the one hand and conflict on the other hand. Hence, you have the great interest of game theories, were pretty close friend of von Neumann, for example, and Morgenstern. So one of the major contribution of Perroux is on the notion of development. So he had three main, let's say, contribution. Was on economic spaces, another on growth pole, I will come back to that later, and then on the notion of development. So Perroux, quite early in the 40s and the 90s, became very unsatisfied on the definition and the uses of the notion of development because it thought they were too tight and too reduced to the single economic dimensions. So he wanted to involve, so he was of course not very fond of the idea of GDP, and he wanted to enlarge it to other types of quantitative and also most systemic insights. And he did propose the new definition of development, and he defined it as a combination of the mental and social changes of a population that make it capable of cumulatively and sustainably growing its overall real product. So this means that it encompasses a lot of structural and social changes on the one hand, and also it involves the qualitative dimension of development. And as an evolutionist economist, he adheres to the idea that there is an evolution in the societies, that there are novelties appearing in the spirit of Schumpeter, and thus there exist various stages of development, but not balanced. He was really against the idea of the convergence of development, so he found it was not correct, and he adheres to the idea of the underdeveloped or emerging countries in the 50s. So his theory became very, very popular at that time, And that's one of the reasons why he acted as an advisor in different underdeveloped regions or countries in order to promote this kind of very, let's say, very contemporaneous definition of development. If we look at the recent indices regarding to that. But if we come to regional science, he made one central contribution, which is known about the term of growth pole theory. So, as I stated already, Perroux was not in favor of a linear vision of development, and he really found that development appeared in different places at different times. So he defines the growth pole theory on the assertion that growth doesn't appear everywhere at the same time. It appears within some places or growth poles with various intensities, and it diffused through diverse channels with varied final effects for the economy as a whole. So the basic assumptions are that the growth is unbalanced, uneven, but it has various peculiarities regarding to the place, the territories, the region, etc. It has a spatial dimension, and also, but it has a variable intensity transmitted through different type of channel. So in the end, a growth pole or development pole, as it is called sometimes, is really a driving economic unit or a set of units, a firm, an industry, a combination or industry, which exerts a driving force within a region or a territory with a lot of mostly training effects. And it's not really far away the idea of backward and forward linkages, which was popularized by Hirschman. And there have been a lot of development on that. So at the beginning, those growth poles are theoretical tools, but they have been also at the basis of a lot of applied approaches, a lot of policy application, and Perroux was very successful in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s regarding to this application, and especially to developing countries or regions. So those growth poles, they are also policy tools, and in the spirit of Perroux, they can exist by themselves, but also they can be created and they can be developed under circumstances by means of policy measures. And this approach has been really taken over by the French public authorities, for example, to develop places like Brittany or the city of Lyon and to various industrial complexes. And it was quite successful in France, I have to say, but it has been also enlarged to several regions or countries in the world, mostly a lot of places in Latin America, in Canada, and also in Africa, where a lot of policies were launched on that basis, be there really development poles as it is defined by Perroux, or in the spirit, let's say, of Perroux. There have been several successes on that, but also there have been identified severe limits to those growth pole policies. Sometimes there have been the so-called white elephants because of the lack of local linkages within the regional or territorial structure. And this is mainly linked to the possible lack of density of local relations. When there are not enough local relations, that's less local linkages, there are leakages outside of the structure, and as a paradox, this development induced by policy measures can profit to other places in different and other regions or territories. So I think I've been quite long enough now just to say a few conclusions about François Perroux. François Perroux made a major contribution to the economic theory in a non-standard way. and especially about the notion of development, which is really really contemporaneous. He also made a major contribution to spatial and regional analysis, especially with the growth pole theory and analysis, and he had a big impact in terms of economic and planning policies worldwide. And also, you have to say, to finish, that he had a very, very positive action as a leader and promoter of a French-speaking regional science association, because he was one of the founders of the French-speaking association 50 years ago. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed, André. Thank you. We can have some questions and answers now. I'm getting an echo. Yeah. Does that mean that you guys have to turn your mic off or something? Right. Okay. Thank you very much for your talk, André. Excellent, and I think filling in a lot of gaps in terms of my knowledge, and probably lots of regional scientists outside the French-speaking section. So, who were the active regional scientists apart from Perroux in developing French regional science? Who were the other key actors at that time?
You know, at that time, you means during the time of François Perroux, at that in this period.
Yes.
Yeah. You know, in the beginning, I think that people were not really interested by these topics, especially economists, and he was quite alone because the one who were interested in this kind of spatial matters were geographers. But Perroux was very, very influential. So he was in Paris, he was at La Sorbonne, first he was in Lyon, then he moved to Paris, to La Sorbonne, and he became really he was a great head. So he created an institute, the Institute of Applied Economics, and then in this institute, they were really devoted to two types of topics. One was on industrial development, and the other was, let's say, spatial planning and so on. So he was really the one who founded this kind of works in the French spirit, and he trained a lot of generation of young scholars who started to work with him and to build on that. So really the impact of Perroux on regional science started twofold. On the one hand, because he created the French-speaking association quite early, and on the other hand, because he promoted this this work between research and so on. And so you can say that 10 years after, appear scholars like Philippe Dallot, Jean-Claude Perrin, other guys like that, who studied with Perroux. They were younger, and then they started to build, on the one hand, regional science, and on the other hand, the French speaking works on that topic.
Yeah.
He was really a pioneer, really.
Yeah. Did he have much connection with Walter Izard during that time?
Their relation was a very a kind of struggle competition, like he should have said, because yes, he had a lot of relation, because when Izard made his travel all around Europe, he came to Paris. He met Perroux at that time, of course, and Perroux was the big head of the French economist, and he was convinced by Izard, so which was a great success for Izard. And then on that basis, Perroux started to build and to build something under the umbrella of Regional Science Association, I could say. But on the other hand, he was not convinced by the ideas of Izard, because in his spirit, Izard was too much a macro economist. And Perroux was not really interested in macroeconomy. he was very fond of the individuals, the agents, the relation between the different spatial units and so on. And he found that the traditional macroeconomics was not interesting because for him, it was a kind of appendix to the general equilibrium theory. And he was really against that.
It's interesting that you mentioned that Izard met Perroux in Paris. This would have been around about 1960, I think.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's quite interesting to see what Walter Izard did at that time. I think he arrived in Le Havre in France and hired a VW microbus.
Yeah.
And made a tour.
A Volkswagen one.
The Volkswagen one, yes. It conjures up a wonderful image of Izard and his big family traveling across Europe. I mean, it took in a lot of places. It took in the Netherlands, it took in Sweden, I think it took in Yugoslavia. Amazing idea of colonizing Europe at that time. But of course, Izard's influence didn't last so long because eventually Europe said, we can do these regional science conferences ourselves. We can run our own sections as the French section has done so successfully. So I think it's interesting to get the perspective from the French side. We hear it from Walter Izard's side, but it's interesting to hear how he was received in France. From what you've said, it does seem like he was very influential in terms of the implementation of his ideas. That it really did influence planning policy. Would you say the same of regional science in France today? Would it be, is there a big interest in seeing regional science applied, or is it more of a theoretical interest?
You know, there have been great times in France for regional science because we had a planning policy, what we call l'aménagement du territoire, spatial planning. During a lot of years, it was started under De Gaulle, and then in the 60s, 70s, and even in the 80s, there were really what we call la Datar, which was the French administration for the spatial planning. And it was really, really influential at that time because they based their works, a large part of their work, on the studies made by regional scientists. I can testimony that because when I was young, I was involved in several planning commissions and so on, just listening to the big names, speaking like Edalo, Perroux, and some other guys speaking about that. But they were very, very influential. But until the 90s, it has changed because now came the times of the neoliberal period, I could say, and then the influence of the data and then the influence also of spatial planning really reduced. So nowadays, I will say that the most important influence is in academic term.
Yeah.
It's not different like a lot of other countries. Thanks, we have a very good journal. So this journal is pretty well known. That's la revue d'économie régionale et urbaine. It's very read. There are a lot of publication in that, but I cannot say that we are really able to influence the choices by the main political actors, as it was the case 20 years or 30 years ago.
Yeah. Thank you very much indeed for answering my questions.
Thank you very much.
I think I thank you very much for your presentation, which I much enjoyed, and I'm sure that our audience will have done so as well. So thank you very much for that. I think we now move on to our second speaker, Hans Westlund. You need to unmute yourself, I think, Hans.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now, yes, that's
Very
right.
good.
So, may I give the floor to you? We've already noticed that you have your chapter already published in Great Minds in Regional Science, and we now move on to your presentation, so over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you see the screen now?
Indeed, yes.
Okay, very good. All right, yeah, I'm going to talk about Gunnar Myrdal, one of the most famous Swedish economists ever, which formerly had no real connection to regional science at all. But as I will try to show, he has still been very influential, not only in Sweden, but worldwide, I would say. Gunnar Myrdal was born in the province of Dalarna in Sweden. He came from a farmer's family, but the first part of the 20th century was a period of industrialization and urbanization, and many people made their class movements. So Myrdal's father was a building contractor, and that meant that he earned quite a lot of money, at least so much that his son could study and become something, as they said. So he started by graduating in law, but quite soon he became interested in economics, and he took his doctoral degree in 1927. Then he was also good at raising funds, so he had periods of studies in both Germany and in Britain. And in 1929 he got a Rockefeller grant, so he could continue his work in the US for a while. And at that time he also published his first book about the political element in the development of economic theory. Next year he became an associate professor at the Institute of International Studies in Geneva, but just a few years after that he became a professor of political economy and public finance at the Stockholm University, where he succeeded his supervisor Gustav Kassel. 1934 he became also a member of the Swedish Parliament for the Social Democratic Party. And 4 years later, he was commissioned by the Carnegie Corporation of New York to study the American Negro problem, which was his report on that was eventually published as an American Dilemma, a 2-volume book about the Negro problem and modern democracy in 1944. 1943 he came back to Sweden. He became a board member of the Bank of Sweden and also chaired the post-war planning commission. He became a minister of commerce and trade in the government, but after a couple of years he moved to Geneva to become executive secretary for the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe. Then he got another commission for the 20th Century Fund of Poverty in Asia, which ended up in the book Asian Drama, which I will say a little more about later. 1961, he came back to Sweden, founded the Institute for International Economics. And the book Asian Drama, an inquiry into the poverty of nations, was published 1968 in 3 volumes. And 1964, he got the Nobel Prize in economics, shared with, very other different economist, Friedrich von Hayek. But the prize committee gave them the prize for pioneering work in the theory of money and economic fluctuations, and for penetrating analysis of the independence of economic, social, and institutional phenomena. Myrdal got over 30 honorary degrees from universities across the world, and first of all, in fact, Harvard University in 1938. If we should say something about private life and politics and so on, he was absolutely an economist, but he was very much also of a sociologist. Then he had a very great interest in institutional arrangements, and upon that he was also a politician. He was known as a very self-assured man. Some people thought he was rude, and there are very many anecdotes about Myrdal. not least about his women affairs. He was known as a ladies' man. Well, at least it was called that at that time. Now, after Me Too, I would guess that there are other concepts for guys like him, less flattering, maybe. He was married with Alva Myrdal, also an extraordinary person, 1964, and they got 3 children. And together, they were really the couple that introduced social engineering in Sweden. They were particularly interested in the crisis of population, low birth rates during the economic crisis in Sweden and elsewhere. And they really argued strongly for support to families in order to build stronger families in Sweden. He was a very active anti-Nazi, and he was also a friend of America, but when the Vietnam War came, he strongly opposed it. Maybe because he loved America so much and thought that it was a real shame of America to engage in that war. I also want to say a little about Alva Myrdal, his wife. She was also very active in politics. She became the Swedish ambassador in India at the same time when Myrdal was working on his big book work, the Asian drama. Later on, she became minister, a member of the parliament, and also minister of the national government, minister of disarmament, and also church minister. And she as well got the Nobel Prize, but in peace, the Peace Prize, 1982. When it comes to scientific contributions, Myrdal's dissertation in the 20s was about the role of expectations in price formation. We shouldn't forget that this was his real basic topic, price theory and price formation. And in stressing the role of expectations, we can say that he was a real pioneer. He influenced the Stockholm School that was active mainly of economists, mainly in the 1930s, but also several of the recent Nobel laureates have gotten their prizes for analyzing expectations in the economy. Myrdal was co-founder of the Econometric Society in London, and it's also possible to say that he was a little of a predecessor of Keynes. In his book Monetary Economics, which was published in Sweden in 1932, he argued for adjusting budget to the economy. And he also launched 2 concepts that today are very standard in economics, the ex ante and the ex post concepts. But most of all, maybe he was the one who stressed the importance of institutions in social science as a broad discipline. When it comes to regional science, or what is connected to regional science, we should first say that his book about the cost of living in Sweden during the 100-year period 1830 to 1930, it was an empirical study of spatial differences over time, more than 20 years before Kuznets launched his hypothesis of an inverted U-curve over the regional disparities. That is, that over a period, say industrialization, we first have low regional disparities, then the increase during the period of industrialization, but then comes to a turning point where the disparities start to diminish again. But Myrdal's empirics, those he presented in this book, did not support Kuznets, because the regional price disparities in Sweden were highest before industrialization, and they diminished as a general trend during the industrialization phase and also thereafter. Myrdal is probably most known for the theory of cumulative causation. It was an concept that he borrowed from the older Swedish economist Knut Wicksell. And he used this concept in the book An American Dilemma, about the situation for the black people in America. And we can say that this is a multi-causal approach, where the core variables and their effects are delineated, and that a change leads gradually to self-reinforcing changes, positive or negative development paths, either as spread effects or backwash effects, as Myrdal expressed themselves. So there, just similar to Perroux, who said that a stable equilibrium does not exist. We could ask, did Myrdal have a spatial perspective? I would say no, not really. He did not really include space and distance in his theory, but still he had a regional perspective, so some kind of understanding of space anyhow he had, although he never used it very much. But in one book, Economic Theory and Underdeveloped Regions, 1957, it was published both in Britain and in the US, and also a Swedish translation about the same time. There he developed the circular cumulative causation theory. And he was contemporary with Perroux and also Hirschman, that published his book 1 year later, but he was much less optimistic. He said, this is what happens. Certain regions develop well at the expense of other regions. So he had not any quick fix ideas about focusing on growth poles or so. And I have a couple of quotes from his book here that I think illuminates his thoughts quite good. He said, for example, that economic theory generally were never worked out to serve the purpose of explaining the reality of underdevelopment and development. And he also added that the play of the forces in the market normally tends to increase rather than to decrease the inequalities of region. Migration, capital, movements, and trade are the media through which the cumulative processes evolves, upward in the lucky regions and downwards in the unlucky ones. Myrdal's biggest work when it comes to number of pages was the 3-volume Asian drama. And he asked the question, why did not the countries of South Asia develop in the way that they should, according to economic theory? And his conclusion there, after lots of empirical data gathering and so on, was that the non-economic factors, institutions, played a decisive role for the lack of development. It was a kind of cumulative causation prevented development. And it was a very, very pessimistic view on South Asia's development potential, which now, 50 years later, we can say it proved to be wrong. So we could then ask, was Myrdal wrong? Well, if we look at world poverty, and in particular what happened in South Asia, yeah, he was wrong. South Asia has developed, indeed. Also China. Myrdal never really analyzed or had any ambitions to analyze the communist states. He dealt with the market economies. But still, we know, both in South Asia and most other countries, that the regional gaps are growing today. Very much in line with the development of the knowledge economy. And there are new theories that more or less are in line with what Myrdal said. And I will just say a little about the endogenous growth theory and the new economic geography. The endogenous growth theory is a theory for the knowledge economy. It stresses that there are increasing returns on knowledge and ideas, and that knowledge and ideas act as drivers of processes of cumulative causation. The pure endogenous growth theory is, I would say, non-spatial. It's a macro theory, but if we add some spatial perspective on it, like Romer did 1992, well, then when we can see how it is connected with Myrdal's thought. Because as Romer said, as the world becomes more and closely integrated, the feature that will increasingly differentiate one geographic area from another will be the public institutions. The most successful areas will be the ones with the most competent and effective mechanism for supporting collective interest, especially in the production of new ideas. And that is in the same line as Myrdal stressed that during development processes, knowledge and other resources become concentrated to a certain region by the market forces. Regarding the new economic geography, we can say that this is more of a theory for the manufacturing area, and that has also been admitted by Krugman. Historic initial advantages or path dependencies play a very important role. So the initial conditions, they may be set by historic factors, but once they are established, these cumulative processes of regional specializations with backward and forward linkages take place based on increasing returns and economies of scale in the regions that have taken the lead. So maybe it's a little exaggeration, but I would in fact say that Krugman formalized Myrdal's theory, and that was the reason that he got the Nobel Prize, in my view. So some final comments about Gunnar Myrdal. He was, I would say, a remarkable person with a remarkable career. He started as a mainstream economist, thinking new ideas, developing theory, but quite soon he became an early critic of mainstream theory. Still, we should also say that he was a child of his time. Regarding South Asia and other areas, he underestimated the long-term structural changes of the economy. He also had a weak understanding of geography and space. But still, the principles of cumulative causation is a central component of these modern theories, and they have clear spatial limitations. So, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Hans. Thanks very much. Thank you. Just a couple of questions. In your chapter in Great Minds in Regional Science, you give a very interesting and amusing example of perhaps how much Myrdal has been forgotten. You talk about somebody going into a bookstore and requesting Asian drama, and the assistant couldn't find this book anywhere. And eventually the person who'd gone into the store said, well, where are you looking? And he said, well, I'm looking under theatre, because of the link with drama, obviously. But do you think that Myrdal gets sufficient credit for his development of ideas amongst recent regional scientists?
I would say no. One reason is, of course, that he had no connection with the regional scientists. He lived in another world, in fact, among other economists and in politics as well. But then it is really interesting that the new economic geography sort of rediscovers Myrdal and also other scholars that have stressed these principles of uneven regional development and so on. So I think he would deserve more credit than he has gotten in regional science.
Yeah. Okay. André, do you have any question to ask? Or perhaps Roberto? No questions. I think. Just checking.
Oh, Peter, may I say something?
Yes, please do.
Yeah. I'm happy to draw a kind of parallel between Perroux and Myrdal. So I didn't mention Myrdal in my statement, but I know that they were pretty well known both, and they know each other. And of course, they share the same interest for the cumulative causation, forward and backward leakages, and so on. So I think at that time, they were really, on the one hand, they were really influential persons, but on the other hand, I'm not sure they were really able to influence the development of economic theory at that time worldwide. So that's the kind of, that's the difference. And nowadays, in a way, we come back until Krugman and other to the ideas that development is uneven, that there are different types of development regarding to the place, the spaces, and so on. So in a way, we found back to their old kind of evolutionist ideas, something like that.
Yeah, I think you're very right there. Well, if we look at the development of the topic, the discipline of economics, it has developed, as we know, the last 50 years to more and more mathematics, more and more formalization, and so on. And Myrdal, he could have chosen to formalize his theory, probably, as Krugman later did, but he didn't want to. He in fact, in Asian drama, in the preface or in the appendix, he even says something about that making these models is more or less fraud, since they cannot include all the essential elements of development that has impact these cumulative causation processes.
You commented on his personality in what you said at the start of your talk.
Yeah.
And you implied that he was quite a difficult man to work with sometimes. And there isn't a school of PhD students who came from Myrdal, I think. Is that right?
That's right. We should, of course, remember that it was not for such a long time that he really was working as a regular professor. Yeah. But from the beginning of the 1960s, he could have had some more PhD students, but there are many stories about that he was more like the one he preached. He told people how it was instead of listening to them.
A one-way process, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, well, I think we now need to move on. Thank you very much indeed, Hans, for your talk and for answering questions. We now bring to the fore Roberto Camagni. It's good to see you. And can I just test that we can hear you? Roberto.
Yep, I'm running under the hat of Roberta. We had some problems in connection.
I'm very relieved to see you there anyway, so welcome. Yeah. One thing that Roberta did say before she went was that we had to finish promptly. So I'm basically saying that we have to finish in about 30 minutes time. Yeah. Otherwise, we'll be cut off in mid-flow. So I hope I'm not considered rude if at any stage in the next half hour I say we've got to end now. But I'm very much looking forward to your speech, Roberto. You're going to talk about Adam Smith. And I realise that you've done a very considerable piece of work on this subject recently. And I think you would admit that you've learnt a lot from it, particularly in terms of what we can learn as regional scientists. Right. So over to you, Roberto. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So Andrea will help me. I don't think I can directly, put my slides. You see my slides? No.
Just say, yes. Just say next slide and it'll move on.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So the title, Adam Smith and Regional Science, a Second Lost Legacy. Next. So, of course, the first point will be why Adam Smith. Then some bios about him. Not a very, let's say, interesting life. Was really a professor, even if he left his position as professor very early. I take up two main issues: theoretical anticipations on subjects, tools, concepts that we use normally in regional science, but did not assign to him. And secondly, some themes that he added that could be very important nowadays, were important as his time, but in my opinion, still are very important for us. Next. So, great mind may seem curious, but it's not. His work that I could call monumental and was embracing almost all dimensions of social life, and quite naturally he encompassed a view on the spatial dimension, and in particular on the relationship between the city or the town and the country. And he added his own capacity of abstraction and model building, so not a big picture of history, but of economic history, economics of institution, a series of revolutions that took place in history, seen from the point of view of the system of production and income distribution. So he, in my opinion, after studying it for 6 months continuously at full time, total time, probably during the lockdown. Working on this, I had a sensation that probably we are facing a second lost legacy. The first one is the one that was underlined by economists like Vivienne Brown and Gavin Kennedy, opposing the let's say trivial idea that he was just, you know, the defender of selfishness in business, not at all, the progenitor of capitalism, the supporter of laissez-faire. This is a picture that was running, and he is still running around, while he, for example, never used the term laissez-faire. Next. So some factual biosketch will be very rapid. Was born in 1723, was Scottish, born near Edinburgh, and always very devoted to his mother. The father, he did never know him because he died before the birth. In 1737, he entered the Glasgow College, knowing already Greek, Latin, French, and English. And at the age of 14, he was made a full immersion into the atmosphere of the Scottish Enlightenment, very important, I would say, in Europe. Francis Hutcheson was his maestro. David Hume was his close friend, and many others. And differently from the French Enlightenment, the Scottish Enlightenment could survive, let's say, with acceptable relationship with the clerical establishment. He won a scholarship to go to Oxford. He went there. And this scholarship implied the promise to be ordained into the Church of England, but he was not satisfied at all of the climate, the cultural climate in Oxford. And in a page of The Wealth of Nations, he said, in these years in Oxford, the greater part of public professors have given up altogether even the pretense of teaching. So he had some problems there. He got the bachelor degree, but he suffered a deep crisis, first with the Christian and clerical environment. They took out from his room the book of David Hume on the treatise on human nature, and probably he was also depressed, or he worked too much. The fact is that he, after 3 years, broke his engagement with the University of Oxford and with the church, and came back home with his mother, moved to Edinburgh, delivering public lectures on rhetoric, belles lettres, progress of opulence, sponsored by the local philosophical society. During the years of Oxford, he entered in contact with the most politically powerful families, one of the most powerful families in Scotland, the Dukes of Argyll, whose interest and patronage was crucial together with his genius in his early career. Next. Some years later, he was appointed the chair of logic at Glasgow University, which turned after 2 years into the chair of moral philosophy, which was his goal, after the death of Francis Hutcheson. And he published soon after the theory of moral sentiments, and got was awarded the doctorate in law. But in fact, he never, this was one kind of honoris causa. Somebody wrote, he died a bachelor. In 1763, he resigned his professorship and took up a new position as tutor of the Duke of Buccleuch, and made his famous tour of France and Switzerland. Very important tour. He met intellectuals of the Enlightenment, encyclopedists, and representative of the physiocratic school. He intended to dedicate his sometimes The Wealth of Nations to Quesnay, François Quesnay, but Quesnay died before the publication, and he left this idea. He came back home after 3 years in France, but did not come back to university, stayed in London, and wrote The Wealth of Nations, published in '76. Then he came back to Scotland. He was appointed a post of Commissioner of the Customs. He continued to write and got an honorary position in Glasgow as Lord Rector. He died in 1790. And after his death, the essays on philosophical subjects and his fantastic history of astronomy, very important in methodological issues, scientific issues, were published as he wanted after his death. Of course, in these essays, he wrote, well, became very apparent his vicinity and closeness with the Enlightenment philosophy, and perhaps somebody said his deism, and not really accepted by the church at that time. And in 1896, another interesting publication was done when were discovered his lectures on jurisprudence, notes from the lecture on justice, police, revenue, and arms, reported by a student when he was in Glasgow, 1763. Next. Wait, sorry. Theoretical anticipations that I found in his works. First, on the origin of cities. I use here much of his words because, of course, I have to justify his presence among the great minds in spatial issues. The surplus produce of the country only constitutes the substance of town. So this is the main thesis that was taken up by most historians, Mumford, Brodel, and then Jane Jacobs also, 200 years after. But he took also the other position, saying that at the turn of the millennium, this natural order of things has been entirely inverted. Commerce and manufactures of cities, instead of being the effect, became the cause and occasion for the improvement of the cultivation of the country. So the increase in the surplus of the countryside came from innovations and improvements, as he said, from the city. But the most important improvement in the country coming from the city was order and good government, which were introduced thanks to the presence of cities, and in particular liberty, security of individuals. So also modernity came into the countryside. But he added something that in modern debate, so these two positions were taken up by the people that I mentioned, but he added something. He saw in particular the experience of the Italian cities in 12th, 13th century, and said when the cities are situated near the coast or on navigable river, the city is not necessarily confined to derive subsistences from the country. They can draw them from the most remote corners of the world. And this is an anticipation of something that is appearing now with the main world cities. They are let's say bodies that are completely separated from their hinterland. They live on commerce, communication, and worldwide networks. Next. So still on the city-country relationship, we have the relationship was conceived as a functional relationship, a division of labor between the two, where the two partners, city and countryside, have a mutual advantage. But we will see that he added something very important beyond that. But then he had very clear the fact that activities in towns are two kinds: basic activities, export to the countryside, of course, and residential activities. So first come smiths, carpenters, shoemakers, tailors, etc., whose services are bought by the farmers, and these people naturally settled in neighborhood of one another and form small village or small town. But the butchers, the brewers, and the bakers soon joined them, and many other artificers and retailers who contribute still further to augment the town. So here we have, we remind, these words remind us the multiplier effect on population. Agglomeration economies, of course, he said, industry, so activities which is carried on in towns are everywhere more advantageous, and this is an obvious observation. But then he had a fantastic intuition, a pearl of theoretical intuition that I never found in the literature. Speaking about the genius or superior talent required in some professions, such as trade of speculation, where you have to understand the future trends, Smith affirms this trade can be carried nowhere but in great towns. It is only in places of the most extensive commerce and correspondence that the intelligence requisite for it can be had. I think that this is one of the most important and earliest, probably, indication of the cognitive role played by the large city. Next. Still on city countryside, which becomes a special archetype, this relationship, he built his general equilibrium analysis, so static equilibrium, the supply and demand in all their internal elements, and of course this is something that also in the physiocratic school is very present. The food produced in the countryside, and services and industry in the cities, and all the exchanges and the equilibrium. And Schumpeter said this is by far the best piece of economic theory turned out by Adam Smith, because it's a piece of economic analysis. He praised very much the analytical part. And his analysis, his book on the history of economic thought is history of economic analysis. But he had a very strong idea on structural dynamics, how in history the modes of production evolve, and the institutions, the political institutions that are around. And this element of the institutions is also present, I remember, in the two presentations on Perroux and Myrdal. And here he traces a masterly piece of economic and social history, indicating, starting from an analysis that Brodel would have called civilisation matérielle, going down on day-to-day mode of living. For example, well, I can just, well, it's two books of the Wealth of Nations on this, so just a footnote. In ancient times, rents were paid in kind. So the problem was what to do with all these rents, and the great proprietors consumed the whole of this in rustic hospitality at home. The great Earl of Warwick is said to have entertained every day 30,000 people in his manors. And this is he said probably is overemphasized, but they were. It's a big number anyway. But when commerce and manufacturers came in, gradually they furnished the great proprietors with something for which they could exchange the whole surplus products of the land, and this was a revolution. Big proprietors started spending in cities their rents, buying buildings or buying jewels and all these ornaments for the gratification of the most childish of all vanities. They gradually bartered the whole power and authority. So it was in his mind the revolution and the passage from the Middle Ages to the modern society. Next,
Roberto, just to remind you, we've just got 10 more minutes.
Yeah. I have to go fast. Theoretical anticipation. The second big elements. Land rent. Land rent. He had in mind very precisely that we have rent of land not only varies with its fertility, but also with its situation. This was already present in William Petty's work, but you know, there were some kind of notes, not a full theory developed on that. Well, fertility, I will run here. He presents a clever definition of bid rent. Rent considered as the price paid for the use of land is naturally the highest which the tenant can afford to pay. Stop. It's differential land, and at the margin, of course, he did not say margin, but land rent is equal to zero. So exactly as it will be written by Ricardo 40 years after. But he had also an idea of absolute land, a kind of aggregate scarcity rent, which was not accepted by Ricardo, but was present in Marx and in Sraffa, who is was a devoted Ricardian anyway. So we cannot stop at a definition of differential land if there is scarcity. Next. Situation rent. Here, the definition is exactly in these three lines the definition of bid rent of von Thunen. Von Thunen does not quote Adam Smith. Does not quote Adam Smith. Okay, and this is exactly the definition of the formula of the bid rent. There are not, of course, the idea of von Thunen's crop rings, but he mentions something that reminds this. Speaking about the demand for grass from the great cities for cows and horses, and given the bulky nature of grass and its higher unit transport cost, it is attracted in the vicinity of the city, while the production of corn is shift outside at the periphery of the regions and even imported. Monopoly, speaking about infrastructure, accessibility, etc., there's an anecdote very important showing the interest conflicts among classes. Some counties near London petitioned the parliament against the extension of the turnpike roads into the remoter countries in order to continue the monopoly of the counties around London. Next, urban house rent. This is the first time that in the history of economic thought we have a treatment very, very precise on building rent. On house rent, divided in building rent, which is just the interest or profit on the capital expended in the building, and ground rents. And the ground rents is a surplus with respect to agricultural rent. So the opportunity cost, of course, that the inhabitants pays for some real or supposed advantage of the situation, thanks to the density of demand, for demand, whatever can be the reason of that demand, whether for trade and business, for pleasure and society, or for mere vanity and fashion. So he took all the elements that are there and should be mentioned as the sources for urban land.
Roberto, just 5 minutes now.
Yes. Well, on urban land rent, he took a position, a political position, saying, well, this is a non-earned income, and especially ground rent comes from the good government of the sovereign. So it's right to it's the proper subject for a peculiar taxation. So the normative part is very straightforwardly linked to the analytical part. Themes overlooked. I will go very fastly. The first, economic power. Speaking about the relationship between the city and the countryside, he said something very, very important in that. starting from history still. Urban guilds and corporations prevented the market from being overstocked, so maintained the market of services and handicrafts understocked, increasing their prices, and of course in the dealings with the country they were all great gainers, and this is the whole trade which supports and enriches every town. The point is what we call now the terms of trade, the prices, the relative prices in the exchange between agricultural products and urban products. Nowadays, they are prices in terms of trade between industry in the countryside and advanced services in the cities, on which probably there is the same element of disequilibrium. And all the element of power is something that is widely lost in regional science. I think that we should come back to his teaching. Next. Second great element and issue, public happiness coming from sympathy, reciprocity, and moral sentiments. Men are done by nature with an interest in the fortune of others, and also in the need of others for assistance. When this assistance is reciprocated, the society flourishes and is happy. And he says something very important. This is not altruism. This is not benevolence. Benevolence is the property of God, not of man. Of course, these sentiments might be absent, but when they are present, society is more happy. And this is something that was in parallel with Adam Smith, developed by the Napolitan Enlightenment, in particular Genovese, all the theory of public happiness, which is now really relaunched after 250 years. Plural agents, importance of trust, etc. And the last point, innovation. Innovation is linked to the division of labor, of course, but he is the next. I jump on the market.
Close now. Can I end the session by thanking all three of our speakers? What you've done is to give us some fascinating accounts. A lot we didn't know about the background of these. Can
you put just the last slide?
The line is going to be
my conclusion.
I understand. I'm sorry about this, but I think you whetted our appetites, all three of the speakers, and I think we really have uncovered a new subject in regional science, which is going to prove very worthwhile. So thank you to the audience, thank you to the organisers, and thank you very much to our speakers. Thank you very much indeed.
Bye.
Bye-bye for now.
Bye-bye.
Bye.